The studio lights cast a sharp glow over the debate panel, their reflections flickering across polished desks as the discussion grew heated. The air was thick with skepticism, the kind that fills the room when people are convinced they know the truth. The host leaned forward, her fingers tapping against the table, her voice sharp as she asked, "So tell me, what has Jeff Bezos actually done for the world?" With a fortune exceeding $160 billion, he has the resources to reshape lives, rebuild communities, and fight global crises. But has he really made an impact? One of the panelists, a seasoned economist, let out a dry chuckle. "Oh, come on. We've seen this before. Billionaires donating just enough to earn good press while their wealth continues to multiply. If he really wanted to help, there wouldn't be millions going hungry. The truth is, money isn't the problem. Priorities are." Across from him, a social activist folded his arms, his tone laced with frustration. "I've stood in shelters where families sleep in their cars because they can't afford rent. I've seen food banks run out of supplies while children go to bed hungry. And you're telling me Jeff Bezos, who could write a check for $10 billion and not even feel it, can't end homelessness? The reality is he doesn't care. He sees numbers, not people." The conversation spread like wildfire, igniting outrage across social media. Thousands took to Twitter, their words laced with anger and disappointment. Jeff Bezos could solve world hunger today and still be a billionaire, but he won't. What's the point of having this much money if you refuse to use it to change lives? Another billionaire who will be remembered for what he didn't do. And while the world debated, while critics tore apart his legacy, Jeff Bezos sat in his office, scrolling through the backlash, his expression unreadable. The city skyline stretched out behind him, a vast ocean of flickering lights, each one a reminder of the world that existed beyond the walls of his empire. The accusations were nothing new. He had heard it all before. The difference? This time, no one knew what was coming. Months later, the world watched as an entirely different kind of event unfolded. A grand auditorium filled with scientists, policymakers, and global leaders, all waiting, all speculating. The whispers in the crowd ranged from curiosity to skepticism. "Another Amazon expansion?" someone murmured. "A space initiative?" another guessed. Jeff Bezos took the stage, his presence commanding, his voice steady. "For decades, I have built businesses that push boundaries, that break barriers. But today, I'm standing here not to talk about what's next for Amazon. I'm here to talk about what's next for all of us. Climate change is not a distant problem. It's happening now. It's in our cities, our forests, our oceans. If we don't act today, we may not have a tomorrow." A hushed silence fell over the room, then the moment that changed everything. "I am committing $10 billion to launch the Bezos Earth Fund, one of the largest individual contributions to climate action in history. This fund will protect forests, restore oceans, advance clean energy, and develop solutions that will ensure our planet remains livable for future generations." For a moment, the room was frozen. Then, whispers, murmurs. The weight of what had just been announced settled in, and beyond those walls, the world erupted. Headlines flashed across every major news outlet. Jeff Bezos commits $10 billion to fight climate change, a historic move. Bezos Earth Fund, a turning point or just another PR stunt? Can a billionaire really help save the planet? Criticism remained. Skeptics questioned his motives. Environmentalists hesitated to celebrate, unsure if this was a symbolic gesture or a true commitment. But while the world debated, something real was already happening. In the depths of the Amazon rainforest, conservation teams mobilized. Researchers who had once begged for funding were now armed with the resources they needed to preserve endangered ecosystems. In Africa, barren land that had long succumbed to drought began to show signs of life as scientists, funded by the Bezos Earth Fund, planted millions of trees to restore natural habitats. In the Arctic, cutting-edge technology was deployed to slow ice loss, an effort once deemed impossible, but now within reach. This wasn't just talk. This was action. Yet even as the impact became visible, doubt lingered. On television panels, journalists debated, how do we know this money will actually be used effectively? How do we know this isn't just another billionaire playing the hero? Jeff Bezos said nothing. No press statements, no defensive interviews, no justifications. Because while the world talked, he kept working. And then, another announcement. Bezos pledged $2.5 billion to end family homelessness. Organizations across the United States that had long struggled with funding suddenly had the means to place thousands of families into permanent housing. From New York to Los Angeles, once overcrowded shelters were finally able to move people into real homes. For families like Maria's, it was life-changing. She had spent nights sleeping in her car with her 2 children, afraid, exhausted, hopeless. Then she received a call from a shelter partnered with the Day One Families Fund. A grant had allowed them to place her into an apartment, fully furnished, stocked with groceries, a place where her children could sleep in beds instead of back seats. The first time she turned the key in her own front door, she broke down in tears. And it didn't stop there. During the COVID-19 pandemic, as millions lost jobs and food insecurity skyrocketed, Bezos quietly donated $100 million to Feeding America. Food banks that had been on the verge of shutting down suddenly had the means to feed millions. James, a single father who had lost his job during the pandemic, walked into a food bank expecting empty shelves. Instead, he found bags of fresh produce, meat, and supplies, all because of a donation he never expected. The world had called him ruthless, indifferent, selfish. But now, the critics were silent. The impact was undeniable. Families who had lost everything now had homes. Millions who had gone hungry now had food. Scientists who had once struggled for funding were now on the front lines of fighting climate change, and just like that, the conversation shifted. Maybe we were wrong about him. Maybe billionaires can make a difference if they actually try. Maybe, just maybe, Jeff Bezos proved us all wrong. But Jeff? He didn't respond to the noise. He didn't engage in debates. Because while the world talked, he kept working. And this was just the beginning. The rain drummed relentlessly against the windshield, a rhythmic tapping that filled the silent car with an eerie, numbing sound. Maria sat in the driver's seat, her fingers gripping the wheel, her knuckles white from the pressure. The night was cold, the kind of cold that seeped through layers of clothing and settled deep into the bones, an unforgiving chill that had become too familiar. In the back seat, her 2 children huddled together beneath a thin blanket, their tiny bodies curled up in the only warmth they had. The car had become their home, the back seat their bed, the dashboard clock their only sense of time. Maria glanced at the gas meter. The needle hovered just above empty. Another problem. Another unanswered question. Another night of pretending she had it all under control. She turned her head slightly, watching her daughter, Sophie, whose tiny hands clutched an old teddy bear, her lips parted slightly as she slept. Beside her, David remained awake, his gaze locked onto the neon glow of a nearby convenience store sign. He was only 10, but his eyes held an exhaustion far beyond his years. He didn't ask questions anymore. He didn't cry when dinner was nothing more than a few crackers and a bottle of water. He had learned far too early that his mother didn't always have answers. She reached for his hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "We'll figure something out," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was saying it for him or for herself. David nodded but said nothing. The shelter waiting list had been endless. The applications, the interviews, the long days of hoping for a phone call that never came. It had all begun to feel like a cruel joke. There were too many families in need, too many names ahead of hers, too many obstacles between them and stability. But then in the stillness of the night, her phone rang. Maria's heart pounded. She fumbled for the phone, hands shaking as she stared at the unknown number. "Hello?" A pause, then a voice. "Maria Sanchez?" She sat up straighter. "Yes, this is Maria. This is Clara from the Day One Families Fund Housing Initiative. I have good news for you." Maria's breath caught in her throat. She barely dared to hope. "Good news?" she repeated, as if saying it aloud would make it real. "We have a home for you and your children." For a moment, Maria couldn't breathe. "A real home?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes," Clara confirmed gently. "A permanent residence, fully furnished, stocked with food. You'll never have to sleep in your car again." Maria's grip on the phone tightened as tears blurred her vision. She had imagined this moment so many times, but now that it was real, she didn't know how to process it. She let out a choked laugh, pressing a trembling hand against her mouth. "When?" she asked, still afraid this was some kind of mistake. "Tomorrow morning," Clara said. "We'll meet you at the shelter. You'll get the keys and we'll take care of everything." Maria closed her eyes, letting the words wash over her. A home. A door that locked. A place where her children would be safe. She turned in her seat, looking at David. He watched her with cautious hope, waiting for her to say something. She took a breath, trying to steady her voice. "We have a home," she whispered. David blinked. "Like an actual home?" She nodded, her throat tight. "Yes, tomorrow." For the first time in months, David smiled. By sunrise, Maria stood outside a small but beautiful apartment complex, the keys cold in her palm. It felt unreal. She hesitated before stepping forward, afraid that the moment she walked in, it would all be taken away. Clara stood beside her, offering an encouraging nod. "Go ahead," she said softly. Maria turned the key in the lock, her hands trembling. The door swung open. The sight took her breath away. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow over the living room. The walls were painted in soft, inviting colors. A plush couch sat against the far wall, a dining table tucked into the corner, a vase of fresh flowers placed neatly in the center. The kitchen smelled of something new, something untouched. And then there were the bedrooms, one for her, one for the kids. Beds. Real beds. Sophie ran inside first, laughing as she threw herself onto the mattress. "It's so soft," she giggled. David stood at the doorway, hesitant, as if waiting for someone to tell him this wasn't real. Maria turned to Clara, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is because of Jeff Bezos?" Clara nodded. "The Day One Families Fund is providing permanent housing solutions across the country. Bezos funded this program to ensure families like yours don't just get temporary shelter but real homes." Maria swallowed hard, nodding as she took it all in. The man the world had called ruthless, indifferent, selfish, he had done this. Over the next few months, Maria's life transformed in ways she had never dared to imagine. She registered Sophie for school. She signed David up for soccer, something he had always wanted but never thought possible. She cooked in her own kitchen, tucked her children into bed without worrying if they would wake up to the sound of sirens or strangers knocking on car windows. She found a job. Slowly, she rebuilt. And she wasn't the only one. Across the country, families who had once lived in cars, on sidewalks, in overcrowded shelters found themselves in homes. The Day One Families Fund had done more than just write checks. It had changed lives. News outlets, the same ones that had criticized Bezos for his wealth, began reporting the undeniable impact. Bezos' $2.5 billion initiative to end homelessness, a game changer. From sleeping in cars to having a home, how the Day One Families Fund is reshaping America. Yet, despite everything, some skepticism remained. There were still those who dismissed it as a publicity stunt, arguing that billionaires could always do more. Maria didn't care about the debates, because now when she woke up in the morning, she didn't have to wonder where her children would sleep that night. She didn't have to drive around aimlessly, searching for a safe place to park. She didn't have to hear David say, "It's okay, Mom," when it wasn't. She had a home. And that was everything. The world had changed overnight. The streets that once buzzed with life had fallen silent, empty sidewalks stretching for miles like ghost towns frozen in time. The neon glow of city lights flickered against the quiet despair that had settled over homes and businesses, a silent reminder that things would never be the same again. The pandemic had arrived like an unstoppable force, stripping millions of their stability, turning lives upside down in ways no one had ever imagined. For James, the days blurred into one long, exhausting cycle of uncertainty. Just a few months ago, he had been a proud provider, working 2 jobs to ensure his son never went to bed hungry. But when the virus swept through the country, it took everything with it. His job at the factory, his side gig at the diner, the little savings he had tucked away for emergencies. Now, emergencies were all he had. The bills piled up. Rent was overdue. The electricity flickered on and off as warnings of disconnection arrived in the mail. Each letter another punch to the gut. But nothing compared to the worst part, the empty fridge, the gnawing hunger in his stomach that he tried to ignore so his son Lucas could eat whatever little was left. James sat at the kitchen table staring at the last can of soup in the cupboard. He had made it stretch as long as he could, thinning it out with water, eating just enough to keep himself moving. He had never felt shame like this before. Never imagined a day where he would have to admit to himself that he couldn't provide for his child. The knock on the door startled him. He hesitated before answering, already knowing who it was. His landlord, standing there with that same impatient look he had worn for the last 3 weeks. "James, I've been patient," the man said, arms crossed. "But I can't keep waiting. I need the rent by next week, or I'll have to start the eviction process." James opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He could feel the heat rising in his face, the crushing weight of helplessness pressing down on him. "I understand," he managed to say. The landlord sighed, softening slightly. "Check out the food banks," he offered, almost as an afterthought. "They're giving out supplies to people who need it." James nodded, though the thought of going to a food bank filled him with a kind of shame he couldn't put into words. He had never been the kind of man to take handouts. He had worked hard his whole life, made sacrifices, built a life for himself and Lucas. But now he had nothing. That night, as Lucas slept curled up on the couch beneath a thin blanket, James stared at his son's fragile frame and made a decision. By morning, he was standing in a food bank line that stretched down the street, wrapping around the block like a never-ending thread of desperation. The air was cold, the kind of cold that crept beneath the skin and settled deep into the bones. He wasn't alone. Mothers holding the hands of small children, elderly men leaning on canes, fathers standing in silence, their pride swallowed whole. James kept his head down, his hands shoved into his pockets as he moved forward inch by inch, waiting, hoping there would be something left when it was his turn. Inside, volunteers worked tirelessly, unloading trucks, stacking boxes, handing out bags of food to families whose faces were etched with exhaustion. The shelves, once bare, were suddenly stocked with fresh produce, canned goods, meats, and bread. And then James heard the whispers. "Did you hear? Jeff Bezos donated $100 million to Feeding America." No way. That can't be real. It's real. That's why they suddenly have enough supplies. That's why we're getting full bags instead of scraps. James froze. Jeff Bezos? The billionaire? The man who people said only cared about profits? He had done this? He took the bag handed to him, the weight of it unfamiliar in his hands. Fresh apples, rice, pasta, cartons of milk, even frozen chicken. Real food, not just leftovers or expired cans. His throat tightened as he looked at the volunteers, their faces beaming as they handed out meal after meal, their energy unshaken despite the chaos around them. For the first time in weeks, James felt something he thought he had lost completely: hope. That night, as he placed a warm plate of food in front of Lucas, watching his son eat without the usual hesitation of saving some for later, something shifted in him. He realized that sometimes help didn't mean failure. Sometimes it meant survival. Across the country, millions of people were experiencing the same relief. Food banks that had once struggled to keep up were now fully stocked, Distribution centers that had been on the verge of shutting down were operating at full capacity, and families that had braced themselves for the worst were now sitting down to real meals for the first time in months. The news spread like wildfire. Jeff Bezos donates $100 million to feeding America amid pandemic crisis. Largest private donation to food banks. Bezos's move sparks debate. The man people called heartless just fed millions? Is this the beginning of something bigger? Yet, even as the impact became impossible to ignore, the skepticism remained. Social media lit up with debates. It's just a tax write-off. $100 million is nothing to him. He could have given more. This doesn't change the fact that billionaires hoard wealth while people suffer. But the people standing in those food bank lines, the parents who no longer had to choose between feeding their children or paying rent, they weren't debating. They were grateful, because to them it wasn't just about numbers, it was about survival. James sat in his apartment that night, the landlord's warning still lingering in his mind. He knew this wasn't over, that there were still battles to fight, still bills to pay, still a future that felt uncertain. But tonight his son had gone to bed with a full stomach, and that was enough. And as the country slowly began to rebuild, the headlines started to shift. The narrative that had once painted Jeff Bezos as nothing more than a greedy billionaire began to crack, revealing something more complex, something harder to ignore. The same people who had once mocked him now had no choice but to acknowledge the reality. His donation had made an impact. It had fed millions. It had kept food banks running when they had been on the brink of collapse. And maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of his philanthropy. Maybe this was just the beginning. The world had been watching. For months the debate had raged on, critics dissecting every move, analysts questioning every donation, social media erupting in endless arguments. Was Jeff Bezos truly changing? Or was this all an elaborate attempt to fix his public image? Some headlines painted him as a visionary philanthropist, a man who had finally used his immense wealth for good. Others remained skeptical, their words laced with doubt and cynicism. Jeff Bezos proved the haters wrong. Or did he? $10 billion for climate, $2.5 billion for housing, $100 million for food. But is it enough? The Amazon empire built on billions. Can money really undo the damage? The chatter was inescapable, but through it all, Bezos had remained silent. No grand speeches, no defensive statements, no interviews explaining his motives. Until now. The stage was set, the cameras positioned perfectly. The air in the studio carried the weight of anticipation, the kind that came before a moment destined to be remembered. The host, a seasoned journalist known for cutting through the noise, sat across from him, her fingers lightly tapping against the polished desk. "You've been called a lot of things," she began, her voice steady, eyes sharp. "Ruthless, greedy, a man obsessed with power and control. But over the last year, you've donated billions to climate action, homelessness, and hunger relief. Some say you've proven everyone wrong. Others say it's all a calculated PR move. So Jeff, let's hear it from you. Why are you doing this?" Bezos sat back in his chair, exhaling slowly. The lights above reflected off the sharp lines of his suit, but his expression remained unreadable. Then, with a small smirk, he leaned forward, resting his hands on the desk. "I never did it for them," he said simply. "I did it because it was the right thing to do." The silence that followed was heavy. The journalist studied him, searching for a trace of hesitation, a flicker of insincerity, but there was none. "You had every reason not to," she pressed. "You could have continued growing your empire, ignoring the backlash, dismissing the criticism. Why now?" Bezos let out a breath, nodding slightly. "Because I realized something. Success means nothing if you don't use it to create change. What's the point of having power if you're not going to use it to help others?" The cameras zoomed in, capturing every shift in expression, every micro-movement that revealed more than words ever could. And beyond the walls of that studio, across the world, the impact of his actions was unfolding in real time. Thousands of miles away, Deep in the Amazon rainforest, conservationists stood beneath a dense canopy of trees, sunlight filtering through the leaves in golden streaks. For years, these lands had been on the brink of destruction. Forests burned, wildlife displaced, entire ecosystems lost to greed. But now, the tide was shifting. With funding from the Bezos Earth Fund, teams had begun the painstaking process of reforestation. Satellite images showed the difference. Areas that had once been barren were now covered in fresh green, the scars of deforestation slowly healing. The indigenous communities who had fought tirelessly to protect their home now had allies with resources, ensuring that what was taken could finally be restored. Further north, in the Arctic, a team of scientists celebrated a breakthrough. The accelerated ice loss that had threatened entire species, rising sea levels that put millions at risk. Now, there was hope. With grants from the Earth Fund, cutting-edge carbon capture technology was being implemented, slowing the damage, buying time for a planet that had been running out of it. And while the Earth was healing, so were its people. In a small apartment in Seattle, Maria sat at her dining table, running her fingers over the smooth wooden surface as her children ate their breakfast, their laughter filling the space. It had been 6 months since she had moved in, 6 months since she had turned the key in the lock of a home she never thought she'd have. Her job at the local clinic was stable now, and for the first time in years, she wasn't living paycheck to paycheck. She wasn't just surviving, she was building a life. The shelter she had once relied on now had dozens of empty beds, a sight she never imagined seeing. More families were being placed into homes every day, thanks to Bezos's $2.5 billion housing initiative. For people like James, the father who had stood in the food bank line with his head down, the change was just as real. He had walked into that food bank expecting nothing, expecting to be handed scraps, to be told there wasn't enough. But instead, he had walked out with enough food to last a month. Fresh produce, protein, milk, real meals, not just survival rations. And it wasn't just him. Across America, food banks that had been on the verge of collapse were now thriving. Shelves that had once been empty were now fully stocked. Volunteers no longer had to turn families away, and the weight of hunger that had settled over millions was beginning to lift. All because of a single donation. $100 million. From a man the world had called heartless. And yet, even as these changes took root, the critics persisted. Bezos could still give more. He's a billionaire. 100 million is nothing to him. This doesn't erase the damage Amazon has done. But for those who had been on the receiving end of that generosity, the debates didn't matter. Maria didn't care what the world thought about Jeff Bezos. James didn't care if the donation was enough in the eyes of critics, because to them it had been everything. Back in the studio, the interview was drawing to a close. The journalist leaned forward, her voice softer now, less confrontational. "One last question," she said. "There are still people who believe this is just a temporary effort, that in a year, 5 years, 10 years, all of this will be forgotten, and you'll go back to being the billionaire who never cared. What do you say to that?" Bezos was quiet for a moment. Then he glanced past the cameras, as if looking beyond the room, beyond the debate, beyond the noise. "I don't need to convince anyone," he said finally. "The work will speak for itself." And as the headlines rolled out the next morning, something had shifted. Jeff Bezos just shut down every critic with one interview. From billionaire to philanthropist, how Bezos's donations are reshaping the world. The moment that changed everything, why Jeff Bezos's legacy will never be the same. Outside the Amazon headquarters, Bezos stood alone, watching the city move below him. This wasn't the end of his story. This was just the beginning. Change doesn't happen in a single moment, nor does it rest on the shoulders of just one person. Jeff Bezos may have proven his critics wrong, but his donations are only a spark in a fire that needs to keep burning. The fight against climate change, homelessness, and hunger isn't over, it's just beginning. The real question isn't about how much billionaires can give, it's about how much all of us are willing to do. If this story inspired you, don't just walk away from it, be a part of the change. Support local food banks. A single meal can make the difference between hope and despair. Donate to housing initiatives. Families like Maria's don't just need a temporary shelter, they need a future. Educate yourself on climate solutions. The planet doesn't need empty promises. It needs action. Bezos took a step, but real change happens when millions of people take action together. So ask yourself, what will you do today that makes a difference tomorrow?